is commonly believed that our knowledge of Vikings is quite complete: long ships, raids, and axe-wielding warriors. However, behind these fearsome images lies a far darker reality. This reality concerns children whose lives were shattered and turned into commodities. Small hands shackled in the holds of ships, children abducted from burning villages, boys and girls sold like livestock in bustling markets. Child slavery was not merely a byproduct of Viking society, but one of the primary drivers behind their expansion across 3 continents. Slave pens in Dublin held thousands of captives. In the markets of Hedeby, children were assessed based on their age and skills. Archaeological discoveries, ranging from mass graves to iron shackles, unveil a history that sagas often omit. How did Viking society transform children into objects of trade? What made a child more valuable than silver? And why did this system spread from Iceland all the way to Constantinople? This narrative is built upon research and verifiable facts, supported by archaeological findings and medieval chronicles, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the accounts of Ibn Fadlan. Let's turn to the events of that era. In the 800s, Viking raids were not spontaneous acts of violence, but meticulously planned harvesting operations. Children were particularly profitable commodities because they adapted more quickly to new conditions, had a longer, useful life in captivity, and required fewer resources for transport. A healthy 10-year-old girl captured in Ireland could be sold in Constantinople for those silver marks, comparable to the cost of an entire ship. Viking strategy was characterized by surgical precision. In the summer of 857, Ivar the Boneless attacked the monastery at Clonmacnoise. His forces took not only gold and manuscripts, but also every child aged 5 to 15, monks, servants, peasant children, anyone small enough not to impede their retreat. On that tragic day, 43 children disappeared. The Irish Chronicle of Kings preserved the exact number of victims. Prisoners were transported swiftly. Viking ships carried human cargo in specially equipped holes located beneath the main deck. Archaeological excavations in Roskilde indicate modifications, iron rings attached to the ship's ribs and waste drainage channels carved into the hull. Children were transported in shackles, packed in tight rows, each given just enough space to lie down. The journey from Ireland to the slave markets typically took about 8 days, weather permitting. By 860, Dublin had become the largest slave trade hub in the Atlantic. The city processed over 1,000 captives annually. Children under 12 were sorted into 3 categories based on strength tests. The weakest were sent to local farms for auxiliary work. Children with average scores were sent to Hedeby for sale in continental markets. The strongest and most attractive were destined for the eastern route, to Novgorod, Kiev, and ultimately Constantinople, where Byzantine nobility was prepared to pay the highest prices for young Scandinavian slaves. Archaeological excavations in Dublin corroborate this grim history. Archaeologists have uncovered iron shackles designed for children as young as 6 years old. Bones found in refuse pits showed evidence of malnutrition and stunted growth. Of particular significance are ship anchor stones with carved marks, each symbolizing the successful delivery of a shipment of human cargo. More than 300 scratches were found on one such stone. Parents were powerless to protect their children, as Viking raids typically occurred during the harvest season when men were working away from home in the fields. In the late summer of 861, Olaf the White raided the coast of Wicklow. His longships appeared at dawn, while fathers were busy gathering grain. Mothers and children attempted to hide in fortified hill settlements, but they could not withstand the Vikings' professional siege tactics. Olaf's forces used incendiary arrows and smoke to compel their surrender. Over 3 days, they captured 218 children. The Annals of Ulster recorded the name of every missing child. This narrative is founded on research and verifiable facts, supported by archaeological discoveries and the Annals of Ulster. Let us now return to the historical events. The market in Hedeby functioned much like a cattle auction. Children were displayed on raised platforms where buyers inspected their teeth, assessed muscle tone, and checked reflexes. Boys capable of lifting 20 pounds of iron ore were selected for work in mines in the Germanic lands. Girls who demonstrated weaving skills were valued twice as highly. Children fluent in multiple languages, Irish, Old Norse, Saxon, became interpreters and were sold at premium prices. Market prices were determined by strict formulas. A healthy 8-year-old boy cost 6 silver marks. The same boy, but with specific skills, such as metalworking or reading, would fetch 10 marks. Girls were valued more highly because they could produce future slaves. A 12-year-old girl with clear skin and no physical defects could be sold for 15 marks, enough to equip a small raiding party. Trading posts in Hedeby maintained detailed records, carved onto bone tablets, reflecting seasonal price fluctuations, bulk purchase discounts, and terms for regular clients. Repeat buyers received coded tags that guaranteed the quality of the merchandise. Ibn Fadlan described seeing children lined up like horses, each bearing a tag indicating age, origin, and special abilities. The slave markets of medieval Europe and Scandinavia were a brutal reflection of an era where childhood innocence became a commodity and life held little value. The Eastern slave trade routes generated exorbitant profits, turning children into living merchandise. A child acquired in Dublin for just 6 marks could be sold in Constantinople for 25, illustrating the monstrous price disparity and immense demand for young slaves. Despite the journey being long and perilous, claiming the lives of approximately 1 in 4 children, those who survived were valued immensely. Byzantine nobility, keen to possess exotic slaves from the north, particularly children, saw them as future elite guards or skilled artisans. Overland routes following the Dnieper River system became paths of sorrow for thousands of children. Slave traders utilized specialized river vessels equipped with locked cargo compartments, effectively transforming them into floating prisons. Chained children received meager sustenance, grain porridge mixed with fish waste, barely enough to sustain their existence. Archaeological discoveries along the Dnieper indicate the presence of fortified trading posts where slave caravans would stop to replenish supplies and sort their human cargo. Kiev, situated at the crossroads of trade routes, developed into a major slave processing center for Eastern commerce. The city's slave district spanned a vast 12-acre area and could accommodate up to 800 captives during peak season. Children were separated from adults and housed in underground chambers dug into the riverbank. These chambers, uncovered by archaeologists, contained sleeping platforms sized for children's bodies and drainage systems for waste disposal, testifying to the inhumane conditions of their captivity. The ultimate destination for most child slaves was the slave market of Constantinople, located by the Golden Horn. Here, Scandinavian traders directly sold slaves to Byzantine officials, who in turn supplied them to imperial palaces and affluent households. Children with fair hair and blue eyes were in particularly high demand, considered exotic in Mediterranean society. The price for a single Scandinavian child could reach the annual salary of a skilled artisan, underscoring the high value placed on child slave labor. Despite the horrific conditions, not all children remained enslaved permanently. The most intelligent and resourceful adapted and ascended the social ladder. Some learned Greek and Latin, becoming secretaries or translators. Others acquired military skills and joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army. In rare instances, child slaves reached positions of power, becoming advisors to emperors, wealthy merchants, and even regional governors. This system flourished because it was profitable for both slave traders and buyers. By 900, Scandinavian slave trading networks encompassed vast territories from Greenland to the Black Sea. Children from Scotland were sold in Morocco, while Irish children became domestic servants in distant Baghdad. The profits generated from the slave trade financed new expeditions, the construction of larger ships, and the development of more sophisticated raiding methods. Archaeological evidence corroborates the scale of this tragedy. Mass graves in Ireland contain hundreds of adult skeletons, but almost no child remains, indicating the systematic capture of children rather than mass killings. Viking-age settlements throughout Scandinavia show a sharp increase in wealth in the mid-800s, coinciding with the peak of the slave trade. Silver hoards buried during this period often contain Byzantine and Islamic coins, providing direct evidence of Eastern trade connections. England also faced this tragedy. In 865, the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. While chronicles describe battles and political alliances, the Vikings dedicated a significant portion of their time to gathering human cargo. York, captured in 866, became a major slave processing center for northern England. Children from Northumbrian villages were sent to Scandinavia or via continental river routes. In Danish settlements, different models for slave utilization were practiced. Instead of immediate export, many captured children were integrated into Scandinavian society as domestic and agricultural laborers. These children often adopted Scandinavian names and customs, but their legal status remained unfree. Runic stones occasionally mention loyal thralls who served their masters for decades. The adoption of Christianity did not end child slavery, but merely altered its rules. Christian Vikings could not enslave their fellow Christians, but pagan children remained legitimate targets. This created incentives for raids on non-Christian territories and resistance to missionary activities in targeted regions. Iceland and Greenland imported Irish thralls until the 11th century. Legal codes of the time reveal how deeply slavery permeated Scandinavian society. Norwegian laws from the 1000s established punishments for killing another person's child slave, procedures for inheriting slaves, and rules for freeing slaves through marriage or military service. Children born to enslaved women automatically became slaves unless specifically manumitted by their owner. Archaeological findings shed light on the daily lives of child slaves. Excavations at Scandinavian farmsteads reveal separate sleeping quarters for unfree laborers, typically located in subterranean rooms or barns. Child slaves consumed different food than free children, primarily grain porridge, with infrequent pieces of meat or fish. Their bones bear witness to arduous physical labor from an early age. Some child slaves resisted their oppressors. The saga of Bjorn Ironside mentions slave uprisings, including one instance where captured Irish children killed their Viking masters and attempted to sail a ship back to Ireland. However, most escape attempts failed, as child slaves often lacked knowledge of local geography or the languages essential for survival. The independent Viking Age began its decline from the late 11th century. Christian kingdoms, having fortified their defenses, became impregnable to Scandinavian raids. The strengthening of European states made it difficult to organize large-scale slave expeditions. Crucially, economic changes led to a decrease in demand for slave labor as European agriculture transitioned to a system of tenancy. Nevertheless, slave trade networks continued to operate longer than commonly believed. 11th century Novgorod documents attest to the activities of Scandinavian slave traders. Archaeological findings in Dublin indicate that the slave market thrived even after 1100. The last recorded instance of Irish children being sold to Scandinavian buyers dates to 1170, nearly a century after the supposed cessation of Viking slave trading. The methods used to handle child slaves were astonishing in their cold-blooded cruelty. The Vikings understood well that a broken spirit created an obedient worker. New captives were separated from their siblings and distributed among different masters to prevent any possibility of coordinated resistance. The slightest transgression, whether crying or refusing an order, resulted in severe punishment, from further reductions to an already meager diet to confinement in dark pits or forced observation of the abuse of other slaves. This breaking process typically took about 3 months. Masters appointed experienced slave mentors who taught newcomers the basic rules of survival. These mentors, often former child slaves themselves, explained which behaviors led to punishment and which might earn minor privileges. Children who demonstrated a capacity for quick adaptation received slightly better treatment. Those who resisted faced an escalation of violence until they either submitted or perished. Physical exploitation began immediately. Child slaves worked from dawn to dusk, regardless of weather conditions. Boys as young as 8 years old hauled heavy fishing nets, herded livestock, and cleared forests for new settlements. Girls were engaged in household chores, food preparation, and textile production. Analysis of the skeletal remains of child slaves indicates muscle development characteristic of arduous physical labor from an early age. The practice of branding and marking served as a guarantee for the return of runaway slaves to their owners. Some masters carved identification marks onto the forearms or shoulders of children. Others used heated metal tools to brand symbols of ownership onto the slave's flesh. The most common method of marking was to carve specific patterns into the earlobes. Each Viking household had its distinctive ear mark, which was recognized throughout the entire trade network. Medical care for child slaves was limited to maintaining their ability to work. Masters treated injuries that impeded labor but ignored pain that did not affect productivity. Analysis of bones found in slave burials reveals traces of untreated fractures, dental diseases, and vitamin deficiencies, which caused constant suffering but did not lead to rapid death. Educational opportunities were provided only if they served the master's interests. Children who displayed natural intellectual abilities might be taught the basics of reading and writing to assist with trade records. Others were trained in specialized crafts, such as metalworking or leather processing. Such educated slaves commanded higher prices upon resale, which incentivized masters to invest in some children while completely neglecting others. Breeding programs demonstrated the highest degree of cold-blooded calculation. Enslaved women who gave birth to healthy children received improved nutrition and lighter work during pregnancy. Masters carefully monitored reproductive cycles and arranged forced pairings between the strongest slaves. Children born to enslaved women legally belonged to the master from birth. Thus, lifelong slavery was ensured through biological means. Seasonal fluctuations significantly impacted the living conditions of slaves. In winter, food rations were reduced to the bare minimum required for survival, not comfort. Summer raids presented opportunities for advancement. Child slaves who distinguished themselves during expeditions might earn minor privileges or even a theoretical chance at freedom. Religious conversion offered no advantages whatsoever. Christian slaves received the same treatment as pagans, as their legal status remained unchanged regardless of baptism. Some masters even preferred Christian slaves, deeming them more reliable and less prone to violent retribution against their captors. The slave resale market operated year-round, adhering to predictable price cycles. Demand peaked in spring as Viking crews prepared for summer raids. In autumn, prices declined due to the approaching winter and transportation difficulties. Astute traders meticulously planned their purchases to maximize profit from seasonal fluctuations. Regional specializations existed within the slave trade networks. Irish children were favored for their perceived docility and adaptability. Saxon children were valued for their intelligence and artisanal skills. Pictish children from Scotland were sold as exceptionally resilient and suitable for work in harsh climatic conditions. In the harsh climatic conditions of the Viking Age, where human life was valued little more than livestock, a ruthless child slave trade flourished. The methods of documenting this inhumane industry are astonishing in their meticulousness. Major slave traders maintained detailed written registers of their human property, utilizing standardized accounting systems. These records documented acquisition dates, sums paid, training costs, and subsequent resynthesis details. Preserved fragments of these documents indicate that profits from successful transactions sometimes exceeded an astronomical 300%. To maintain their reputation and ensure client satisfaction, reputable slave traders offered unique guarantees on their human merchandise. For instance, a child who died within 30 days of sale could be replaced with another at half price. If a child proved unsuitable for a particular task, they could be exchanged for another slave of equivalent value. The transportation infrastructure of the slave trade featured highly developed logistics. Regular sea routes connected major slave markets, operating on a precise schedule. Captains of slave ships, specializing in the transport of human cargo, refined their expertise in sustaining the lives of children during long sea voyages. For their services, these specialists commanded higher fees. To protect investments during transport, insurance systems were employed. Slave owners frequently formed partnerships to distribute risks across multiple shipments of slaves. In the event of a shipwreck or the capture of a vessel, losses were shared among the remaining partners, thus preventing complete financial ruin. This distribution of risk encouraged larger-scale operations that would have been inaccessible to individual traders. Banking networks facilitated long-distance transactions. In major trade centers, credit systems were developed that allowed for the purchase of slaves without immediate silver payment. Trusted dealers received advance payments for future deliveries. These financial innovations fostered trade expansion and enhanced market efficiency. The legal system also played a role, creating conditions to support the slave trade. Courts developed procedures for resolving disputes over slave ownership. Laws established punishments for slave theft and defined the process for returning runaway living tools. These legal guarantees encouraged investment in the slave trade, reducing entrepreneurial risks. Child mortality rates in slavery were appallingly high. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian settlements indicates that less than half of enslaved children survived their first 2 years in captivity. Malnutrition, excessive labor, and deliberate neglect led to child slave mortality being 3 times higher than that of free children in the same communities. Slave owners factored these losses into their business plans. Psychological manipulation became an integral part of the slave trade. Vikings discovered that traumatized children exhibited greater submission than defiant ones. Separation from family fostered dependence on masters, upon whom their basic survival needs relied. Some children developed Stockholm syndrome, beginning to defend their captors and assist in the capture of other children during raids. These psychologically broken slaves often became the most reliable domestic workers. Escape attempts followed predictable patterns. Most escapes occurred within the first 6 months of capture, before psychological conditioning reached its peak. Children most often fled during winter months, when shorter daylight hours provided more darkness for movement. However, the success rate of escapes remained extremely low due to unfamiliarity with the terrain and language barriers. The system of punishment for escape was clearly regulated. A first offense resulted in a 3-day reduction in food rations. A second escape attempt was punished with a public whipping, intended to intimidate other slaves. A third attempt usually ended in mutilation designed to permanently incapacitate the slave from escaping, severed tendons, amputated fingers, or brand marks on the face. Few children managed to survive and attempt a fourth escape. Rituals in slave markets were imbued with calculated dehumanization. Potential buyers inspected children like livestock, checking teeth to determine age, assessing muscle strength and overall health. During inspection, children were expected to remain silent, otherwise they faced immediate punishment. Buyers haggled over prices, discussing the child's physical attributes and capabilities as if the child did not understand their words. The design of specialized slave ships had unique features. Archaeological findings indicate the presence of vessels with reinforced holds, additional drainage systems, and modified ventilation specifically designed for transporting people. These ships sacrificed space for other goods to maximize capacity for slaves during peak trade seasons. Age categories determined market value and handling protocols. Children under 7 years old were cheaper but required more care during transport. Children aged 8 to 12 were considered an optimal investment, old enough to perform work but young enough for psychological conditioning. Teenagers were valued more highly but presented a greater risk of escape and rebellion. Child slavery during the Viking Age represented a complex system of exploitation where gender differences, working conditions, and geographical location profoundly impacted the fates of young captives. Masters constantly balanced maximizing profit with preventing the risk of rebellion. Gender differences shaped distinct market niches. Boys were valued for physical strength, necessary in mining, agriculture, construction, and military service. Girls faced double exploitation, subjected to forced reproduction and sexual violence. Because of this, girls often commanded higher prices, as they represented multiple types of value to buyers. Integration into a new environment heavily depended on the destination. In Scandinavia, domestic slaves could, over time, earn a status almost akin to family members. Agricultural slaves were condemned to lifelong servitude with no hope of improvement. Urban slaves in trade settlements sometimes gained freedom due to unique skills or exceptional loyalty to their masters. Diet was a tool of control. Masters provided slaves with a minimal amount of food, just enough to sustain their ability to work, but insufficient to build strength needed for escape or rebellion. Archaeological findings from waste disposal sites indicate that diets primarily consisted of grain porridge, vegetable scraps, and rare fish bones. Clothing and housing underscored slave status. Child slaves were given minimal clothing, intended more for functionality than for warmth and comfort. Their dwellings were barns, cellars, or annexes to main buildings. These spaces offered protection from the elements but were deliberately uncomfortable, emphasizing social hierarchy. The labor distribution system aimed for maximum economic benefit. Masters assessed each child's abilities and assigned appropriate tasks. Children with mathematical aptitude assisted in trade calculations. Children with developed motor skills were trained in weaving. Physically strong children were sent to agricultural, construction, or other heavy labor. Emancipation rarely benefited child slaves. Freedom was usually granted only after the master's death. Exceptional service during emergencies or redemption by relatives were unlikely for most children. Even freed slaves often remained economically dependent on their former masters due to a lack of property, skills, or social connections. Regional differences led to the formation of unique slave cultures. Irish children in Iceland often retained their Celtic language and customs within slave communities. Saxon children in Norway might transmit English traditions through oral storytelling. These cultural enclaves served as a source of psychological support, but also marked them as outsiders, potentially dangerous. Attention to health was limited to preventing epidemics, not individual treatment. Masters isolated sick slaves to prevent disease spread, but did not provide medical care. Children who contracted serious illnesses were often abandoned or killed, as replacing them was cheaper than prolonged treatment. Breeding programs aimed to improve the slave workforce. Masters selected pairs based on desired qualities, strength, intelligence, appearance, or specialized skills. Children born from these forced unions inherited their parents' slave status, but might receive somewhat better treatment if they displayed valuable qualities. Slaves created complex communication networks. Children invented secret languages, mixing their native tongues with Norse vocabulary. Gestures and behavioral signals allowed information exchange unnoticed by masters. These networks helped coordinate survival strategies and sometimes facilitated group escape attempts. Seasonal work influenced living conditions. Spring planting saw increased food rations to ensure sufficient strength for intensive labor. Summer raids could offer individual slaves opportunities to join expeditions. Autumn harvests demanded maximum effort with reduced rest time. A recent discovery has shed light on the tragic fate of child slaves. During construction work in modern Dublin, a medieval refuse pit was uncovered, containing hundreds of children's bones. Radiocarbon analysis dated the burial to 950 to 1000 AD, a period of flourishing Viking slave trade. The bones bear traces of malnutrition, heavy labor, and systematic violence. Among the remains, a piece of carved wood with runes was found, which read, "We were taken." The youngest child was only 5 years old.